8 million people call this city home. On any given day, more money moves through the financial systems below you than through most countries on Earth. The skyline you are looking at is one of the most recognized images in human history. It appears in movies, in the dreams of people who have never left their hometown, in the imaginations of children growing up in villages on the other side of the planet who have decided, without ever having been here, that this is where their story needs to happen. Now hold that image, because 400 years ago, there was no city here, no towers, no bridge, no streets, just a narrow island, a cold harbor, a forest running from one end of the land to the other, and a people who had lived here for thousands of years without the outside world knowing they existed. In 1626, a Dutch trading company purchased this island for trade goods often retold as being worth roughly $24. That transaction, made by merchants thinking about beaver pelts and profit for its shareholders, set off a chain of events that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted. What grew from it became the financial capital of the world, often described as the most filmed city on Earth, and perhaps the place where more people have chosen to start over than anywhere else. This is the story of how that happened. Sit back. We are going all the way to the beginning. Chapter 1. Before the Europeans, the Lenape and the island called Mannahatta. Imagine you could unzip Manhattan from everything built on top of it and pull the city away like a skin. What you would find underneath is an island that most New Yorkers have never seen and would not recognize. That is exactly what a team of ecologists and historians spent years trying to reconstruct. Using colonial land surveys, soil records, plant fossils, and the accounts of the earliest European visitors, the Wildlife Conservation Society completed a project in 2009 called the Mannahatta Project. Their goal was simple and almost impossibly ambitious. Show the world what this island looked like before anyone built anything on it. What they found changed the way many people think about New York forever. The island that would become the most built-over piece of land on Earth was, before European contact, one of the most ecologically diverse places in the entire northeastern region of North America. More than 55 distinct land cover types existed on an island you can walk across in 30 minutes. Forests of oak, chestnut, and hickory covered the higher ground. Wetlands spread across the lower edges. More than 50 freshwater ponds and streams ran through the interior. The shoreline was lined with oyster beds so dense that the shells formed reefs visible above the waterline. Estimates from the Mannahatta Project put the oyster population of New York Harbor at somewhere around 220 billion individual animals. The water was clean enough that oysters grew to sizes rarely seen today. Bears lived in the forests of what is now Midtown. Wolves ranged across the northern end of the island. Passenger pigeons, a species that would be hunted to extinction by 1914, flew over Manhattan in flocks so large that early witnesses described them as blocking the sun for minutes at a time. This was the world the Lenape people had lived in and actively managed. According to archaeological evidence, for somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 years, the Lenape were not a single tribe in the way that word is sometimes understood. They were a network of related communities sharing language, culture, and territory across what is now New Jersey, Delaware, southeastern New York, and the lower Hudson Valley. The people living on and around the island they called Mannahatta, a word that translates roughly as Island of Many Hills, were part of this broader world, connected by trade, kinship, and a shared understanding of how to live sustainably on this specific landscape. Their relationship to the land was functional in ways that European observers consistently misread. Early Dutch and English accounts describe the Lenape as people without agriculture, without permanent settlements, without real ownership of the land. All three observations were wrong, or at minimum deeply incomplete. The Lenape practiced a form of agriculture so sophisticated that modern sustainable farming researchers still study it. They planted corn, beans, and squash together in a combination that farmers across multiple continents had independently discovered maximizes yield while maintaining soil health. The beans fix nitrogen. The squash leaves shade the ground and retain moisture. The corn provides structure. This was not accidental. It was the product of generations of careful observation and deliberate refinement. Their settlements were not permanent in the European sense, but they were not random either. The Lenape moved seasonally in patterns that reflected a detailed understanding of where resources were and when. Winter camps in sheltered inland areas, summer camps along the coast and riverbanks where fish were running. The locations they chose were the product of centuries of accumulated ecological knowledge. When Europeans later built their own settlements, they frequently built them in exactly the same places, because the same logic of terrain, water access, and shelter applied to everyone. The concept of land ownership, however, had no direct equivalent in Lenape legal thinking, and that gap would eventually cause catastrophic harm. The Lenape understood land as something that could be used, and use rights could be shared or transferred. But the idea that land could be permanently alienated from a community the way a physical object could be sold was not part of their framework. When they later agreed to arrangements with Dutch settlers that the Dutch recorded as land sales, the Lenape appear to have understood those arrangements as agreements about shared use. The consequences of that misunderstanding would define the next 4 centuries of history on this island. The Lenape were skilled traders and skilled navigators. Objects found at Lenape sites in this region include copper from the Great Lakes, shell beads from coastal areas to the south, and materials that could only have come from hundreds of miles away. They were not isolated people on an isolated island. They were participants in trade networks connecting communities across a vast portion of eastern North America. By the time European ships appeared in the harbor in the early 1500s, the Lenape population in the broader region was probably somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people, though historians note that pre-contact population estimates carry significant uncertainty. The first Europeans to sail into the harbor were not Dutch. In 1524, a Florentine navigator named Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing for King Francis I of France, spent what he described as a pleasant day in the outer harbor, noted the extraordinary beauty of the bay, and continued up the coast. He did not stay. His report reached France, was filed away, and the harbor sat undisturbed for another 85 years. The Lenape watched his ship disappear and returned to their lives. They could not have known that the world which had existed for 15,000 years was now on a countdown. When Europeans came back, they came with intentions that had nothing to do with the Lenape and everything to do with a global competition for trade and resources that was reshaping the entire planet. And the man who came back first was not looking for a place to build a city. He was looking for a shortcut to China. Chapter 2. Henry Hudson and the River That Changed Everything. On a September morning in 1609, a small English ship called the Half Moon sailed through the narrows of the outer harbour and into one of the finest natural waterways on the Atlantic coast of North America. The captain standing on its deck had already failed twice. His name was Henry Hudson. He was an experienced English navigator who had made 2 previous voyages, attempting to find a northeast passage over the top of Russia and into Asia. Both times, ice had stopped him. Now he was trying something different, sailing west instead of east, working from notes and theories about a possible water route through the middle of North America. He was sailing for the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC. Often described as the world's first modern publicly traded company, an organization that issued shares to investors, operated its own warships, governed its own territories, and answered to shareholders who expected profit in return for their investment. The VOC had given Hudson a specific assignment: find a northwest passage to Asia. Come back with a route that cuts months off the journey to the spice trade. Hudson had his own theories about where such a passage might be found, somewhere around the 40th parallel. That theory was wrong, but it brought him to exactly the right place. The river that now carries Hudson's name is not a typical river. For much of its length, it is a tidal estuary, meaning salt water from the ocean pushes into it with each tide, sometimes as far as 150 miles upstream. It is wide, deep, and navigable by ocean-going vessels in a way that rivers of its size are not always navigable. When Hudson sailed north on it for the first time that September, his crew's log entries read less like navigation records and more like letters home from a dream. Robert Jewett, an officer on the Half Moon who kept a detailed journal of the voyage, wrote about forests so thick that trees came to the water's edge, about grapes growing wild along the banks, about the extraordinary numbers of fish visible in the clear water. He described the people who came out to trade in canoes as friendly and well-dressed, wearing mantles of feathers and robes of fur. Hudson sailed north for about a week, traveling roughly 150 miles upstream to the area near present-day Albany. There, the river became too shallow to continue. He understood immediately what this meant. There was no passage here. The river did not go through to the Pacific. It went to the mountains and stopped. He turned around. From a purely practical standpoint, the voyage was a failure. Hudson returned with no passage to Asia, only a detailed account of a river that led nowhere useful to the VOC's original purpose. He never returned to this river. The following year, he made one more voyage, this time for an English company, searching for a northwest passage through what is now northern Canada. His crew mutinied. They put Hudson, his young son, John, and 7 loyal crew members into a small, open boat in the enormous northern bay that now bears his name. Hudson was never seen again. But the report from the 1609 voyage did not go unnoticed. Here is where the history becomes more complicated than the simple version usually told. The VOC itself did not move quickly on Hudson's findings. It was focused on its Asian trade monopoly and had limited interest in the fur trade of North America. What happened instead was that a group of independent Amsterdam merchants, operating separately from the VOC, recognized the commercial opportunity Hudson's report described. In 1610 and 1611, they sent their own follow-up expeditions to the river. By 1614, this group had formed the New Netherland Company specifically to exploit the fur trade on the Hudson River. And they built a small trading post near present-day Albany called Fort Nassau. This was not yet a colony. It was a commercial operation, a seasonal outpost staffed by traders who came to exchange European goods for furs and then sailed home. What drew those merchants was a specific commodity that drove much of early North American exploration in ways that are easy to underestimate from today's vantage point. Beaver. In the early 1600s, beaver felt hats were the dominant fashion accessory among wealthy and aspiring Europeans. The demand was enormous and growing. The beaver population of Europe had been hunted to near extinction. North America, by contrast, had beavers in numbers that European traders could barely comprehend. The Lenape and other indigenous peoples of the region had been trading beaver pelts with European fishing vessels for decades before Hudson arrived. They understood the value Europeans placed on furs. The trade was already established in principle. What the Hudson River offered was a deep-water route into the interior, where the beaver populations were even larger and indigenous trading networks extended hundreds of miles in every direction. The Dutch West India Company, a separate entity from the VOC, was chartered in 1621 and eventually absorbed the trading operations along the Hudson River. It was this company, not the original VOC that had hired Hudson, that would build the permanent settlement at the mouth of the river. The question of where to base that settlement had an obvious answer. The island at the mouth of the river sat at the point where the Hudson met the harbor. Everything coming down the river had to pass it. Every ship entering or leaving the harbor had to pass it. It was the geographic keystone of the entire waterway, the one point that controlled access to everything else. The Dutch looked at that island the same way every empire in history has looked at a strategic choke point. They saw control. They saw leverage. They saw money. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company sent its first permanent settlers to the region. Most went upriver. A small group stayed on the southern tip of the island. 2 years later, a man named Peter Minuit arrived as the new director of the colony and made the transaction that every American schoolchild learns about and almost nobody fully understands. He purchased the island from the Lenape. The details have been distorted by centuries of retelling. The figure, often retold as roughly $24, comes from a 19th century calculation converting the value of trade goods, recorded in Dutch sources as worth about 60 guilders, into period currency. The goods themselves were likely fabric, tools, and metal implements with genuine practical value to the Lenape, to Peter Minuit and the Dutch West India Company. It was a land purchase. Title transferred. The island now belonged to the company, to the Lenape. The historical evidence suggests something closer to a use agreement. They were agreeing to something, They were not agreeing to the same thing the Dutch thought they were agreeing to. That misunderstanding was not accidental on the European side. Colonizers across North America consistently exploited the gap between their legal framework and indigenous legal frameworks to acquire land on terms that indigenous peoples would not have accepted if stated plainly. What the record tells us is what happened next. The Dutch began to build. Chapter 3. New Amsterdam, the company town that invented New York. Forget everything you think you know about why American cities were founded. The Pilgrims came to Plymouth in 1620 to escape religious persecution and build a community of faith. The Puritans came to Massachusetts to create what they called a city on a hill, a model for the Christian world. Whatever the complications of those founding stories, they center on idealism, on the idea that the people who came were building something that mattered beyond profit. New Amsterdam was not built on idealism. New Amsterdam was a business decision. The Dutch West India Company founded the settlement at the southern tip of Manhattan in 1626 for one reason. It needed a base of operations for its fur trading enterprise in the Hudson River Valley. Everything else, the houses, the church, the government, the streets, followed from that single commercial logic, and that origin shaped everything about what New York eventually became. In the earliest years, the settlement was modest to the point of being almost comically inadequate for the strategic importance of its location. The first structures were rough wooden buildings clustered around a small fort at the southern tip of the island. The fort itself was poorly constructed. A Dutch official who visited in the early 1630s wrote back to Amsterdam describing the settlement in terms that suggest he was not impressed. The company struggled to attract settlers. This was a persistent problem throughout the New Amsterdam period, and it stemmed directly from the commercial nature of the enterprise. The Dutch West India Company was not offering land and freedom. It was offering employment. People who came in the early years came largely as company employees, indentured servants, or enslaved people, not as free colonists building their own futures. The solution the company tried was a system called patroonship. Large land grants along the Hudson River were offered to wealthy investors who agreed to bring over at least 50 settlers to work the land. The patroons would essentially be feudal lords. It was a system borrowed from Dutch agricultural tradition and transplanted to North America, and it largely failed. One patroonship that did survive, granted to a merchant named Kiliane van Rensselaer for land near present-day Albany, lasted for generations and created a class of tenant farmers whose resentment would fuel political conflicts in New York well into the 19th century. Despite all of this, something was happening in New Amsterdam that was not happening in Plymouth or Boston or Jamestown. People from everywhere were showing up. By the early 1640s, a Jesuit missionary visiting the settlement reported hearing 18 languages spoken in a community of just a few hundred people. This was not a policy. It was not a vision. It was a consequence of commercial logic. The Dutch West India Company was not in the business of building a Christian commonwealth or an English nation in the New World. It was in the business of making money, and money does not care where you come from. The colony drew Dutch settlers, but also Walloons who were French-speaking Protestants, Germans, Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes. It drew Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution in Brazil after the Portuguese retook that colony from the Dutch in 1654. It drew English settlers from neighboring colonies who found New Amsterdam's commercial atmosphere more congenial than the religious strictness of Massachusetts. And it drew Africans, both enslaved and free. The first enslaved Africans arrived in 1626. The same year as the famous purchase, their labor built the physical infrastructure of the colony. The diversity of New Amsterdam was real, but it should not be romanticized. The colony operated a system of enslaved labor. The rights extended to different groups were unequal and often explicitly discriminatory. One moment from this period illustrates how hard those rights were to obtain, and how much they mattered to the people fighting for them. In 1655, a Jewish soldier named Asser Levy petitioned the colonial government for the right to stand guard duty alongside Christian soldiers, a right that came with civic recognition the company had been withholding from Jewish residents. The local government denied him. Levy appealed directly to the company directors in Amsterdam. He won. His case became one of the earliest successful assertions of Jewish civil rights in North America. One not through the benevolence of Peter Stuyvesant, who had opposed it vigorously, but through the commercial logic of a company that had Jewish shareholders and could not afford to alienate them. What New Amsterdam had was not equality. What it had was a pragmatic tolerance rooted in commercial interest. If you could trade, if you could work, if you could contribute to the economic life of the settlement, there was a place for you here. That is not the same as a principle, but it produced a city with DNA fundamentally different from the religious colonies of New England. And that difference persisted for 400 years. The physical shape of the city began to take form in these years. A wall was built across the island in 1653, running from the Hudson River to the East River, to defend against a possible English attack from the north. The street running alongside this wall would eventually become the most famous financial street in the world. It is called Wall Street, and the name is exactly what it sounds like. A canal was dug through the center of the lower settlement. It was later filled in and became Broad Street. A market was established. A church was built. The settlement began, slowly, to look less like a temporary trading post and more like a permanent town. The man who dominated the final years of New Amsterdam was Peter Stuyvesant, who arrived as Director General in 1647 and governed until the English took the colony in 1664. Stuyvesant had lost his right leg in a military campaign in the Caribbean before arriving, and he wore a wooden leg decorated with silver bands that became his signature. He was blunt, opinionated, deeply religious, and convinced that he knew better than almost everyone around him. He improved the settlement significantly. He established a night watch that was the precursor to a police force. He regulated trade, built roads, and enforced standards his predecessors had allowed to slide. Under his administration, New Amsterdam began to function more like a real municipal entity. He was also intolerant in ways that repeatedly brought him into conflict with the company in Amsterdam. When a group of Quakers arrived in 1657, Stuyvesant had them arrested and subjected to harsh treatment. The company wrote back to him in explicit terms, ordering him to allow freedom of conscience to all settlers regardless of belief. The letter they sent has become an important document in American religious history. It is one of the earliest official statements of religious tolerance in the New World, and it came not from a moral impulse, but from a business calculation. Persecuting settlers was bad for recruitment. Stuyvesant tried similarly to expel the Jewish community and was overruled by the company. The pattern this established would repeat throughout New York's history. The impulse toward exclusion repeatedly lost to the commercial logic of inclusion. Not because New Yorkers were more virtuous than people elsewhere, because restricting participation cost money. By 1664, New Amsterdam had a population of somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people. The fur trade that had justified its existence was declining as beaver populations in accessible parts of the Hudson Valley were hunted out. But the city had the harbor, it had the river, it had the geographic position that made it the logical center of trade for the entire northeastern coast of North America. The English understood all of this perfectly. In August of 1664, 4 English warships sailed into the harbor and anchored off the southern tip of Manhattan. Their commander, Colonel Richard Nicolls, sent a letter to Peter Stuyvesant informing him that the King of England had granted these lands to his brother James, the Duke of York, and requesting the peaceful surrender of the colony. Stuyvesant wanted to fight. He tore up the first letter. He climbed to the top of the fort and stood there refusing to come down. The people of New Amsterdam did not want to fight. A group of prominent citizens, including Stuyvesant's own son, presented him with a petition signed by 93 people asking him to negotiate rather than resist. Stuyvesant came down from the fort. On September 8th, 1664, New Amsterdam became New York. The Dutch inhabitants were allowed to stay. Their property rights were respected. The transition was so smooth that the city barely paused. The commercial life of the town went on the next morning exactly as it had the morning before. The names changed. The flag changed. The fundamentally transactional nature of the place did not change at all. Chapter 4. The English take over and New York learns to argue. The morning after New Amsterdam became New York, a merchant on Pearl Street opened his shop at the usual hour. This is not a coincidence. It is the point. The transfer of power in September of 1664 was one of the smoothest colonial handovers in the history of European expansion in North America. No battle, no burning, no flight of refugees. The Dutch inhabitants kept their property, their religious practices, and their trade relationships. Most of them took the deal and got on with their lives. But underneath that surface, calm, something important had changed. And over the following decades, that change would produce a political culture in New York that was angrier, louder, and more contentious than anything developing in the colonies around it. The Duke of York, who now owned the colony as a personal possession granted by his brother King Charles II, had no interest in self-government. Under Dutch rule, New Amsterdam had at least had local advisers who could petition the Director General. It was not democracy, but it was something. The Duke abolished even that. New York, under his ownership, was governed by a royal governor appointed by the Duke, answerable to the Duke, and not required to consult the people being governed about anything at all. The merchants of New York, who had built their livelihoods on the ability to negotiate and argue their interests against anyone who stood in their way. did not accept this quietly. The conflict between the commercial class of New York and the authority of its appointed governors became the defining political drama of the English colonial period. It produced some of the most important precedents in the history of American free speech. It also produced some of the most spectacular political corruption in colonial North America, which, given the competition, is a significant achievement. The population grew steadily under English rule. By the 1680s, New York had around 4,500 residents. By 1700, that number had roughly doubled. More English settlers were arriving. But the Dutch families, who had been there since the New Amsterdam period, remained prominent. And the city kept the polyglot, commercially focused character it had developed under Dutch rule. The harbour was the engine of everything. Goods from the interior came down the Hudson. Ships arrived from England, from the Caribbean. From every direction the Atlantic world connected. The merchants who controlled this trade were building fortunes that made them the most powerful private individuals in the colony. And they were not inclined to let a royal governor appointed by a distant aristocrat tell them how to run their business. The tension produced one collision that stands above all others, because of what it created. In 1734, a German-born printer named John Peter Zenger published a series of articles in his newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal, criticizing the royal governor William Cosby. The articles were sharp, specific, and personal. They accused Cosby of corruption, of rigging elections, of abusing his authority. Cosby had Zenger arrested and charged with seditious libel. Under English law, at the time, truth was not a defense against libel. If you printed something critical of the government, you were guilty regardless of whether what you printed was accurate. The jury's only job was to determine whether the defendant had printed the material. Zenger's lawyer, a Philadelphia attorney named Andrew Hamilton, made an argument that tore through this framework. He acknowledged that Zenger had printed the articles. He then argued directly and passionately to the jury that they had the right and the duty to consider the truth of what was printed, and that printing the truth about a corrupt official was not a crime regardless of what the law said. The jury found Zenger not guilty. The verdict was legally irregular. The jury had technically exceeded its authority. But no one in New York was interested in overturning it. Crowds outside the courtroom cheered. The case was published and circulated throughout the colonies. It became one of the foundational documents of what would later be called freedom of the press. Decades before the First Amendment existed, a jury in New York had decided that the government did not have the right to punish people for telling the truth about it. This was New York doing what New York does, finding the argument, taking it all the way, and winning. The Navigation Acts England imposed on its American colonies required colonial merchants to trade primarily with England and on terms that benefited English interests. For the merchants of New York, who had built their fortunes on flexible, multi-directional Atlantic trade. These restrictions were not just economically damaging. They were an insult to the commercial culture at the heart of the city's identity. Smuggling became routine. The line between legitimate trade and illegal trade was crossed so casually and so frequently that the distinction barely registered. Colonial governors who tried to enforce the Navigation Acts found themselves outmaneuvered or bribed. One governor, Benjamin Fletcher, became so openly involved in protecting pirates who brought plunder into New York Harbor that the English crown eventually recalled him. The pirates spent their money freely in the city's taverns and shops and were welcomed accordingly. By the 1740s, New York was the second largest city in the British colonies, behind only Boston. Its population was approaching 10,000. Its politics were loud. Its merchants were rich. And its residents had developed a set of habits that would prove extraordinarily consequential when the question of independence arrived. New Yorkers had been arguing with their government for 80 years before the Revolution began. They were ready for the fight. What they were not ready for was the choice it demanded. Because breaking from your government and breaking from your empire are very different things. And New York, more than any other colony, understood exactly how much it stood to lose. Chapter 5. Revolution, the city that backed the crown, then became its capital. In the summer of 1765, a new law arrived from London and lit a fuse that had been waiting for a spark. The Stamp Act required that all printed materials in the American colonies, newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, playing cards, carry a tax stamp purchased from the British government. It was not the largest tax ever imposed on the colonies. What it was visible. Every merchant who signed a contract, every lawyer who filed a brief, every printer who published a newspaper would see and feel and pay this tax in a way that earlier, more invisible forms of colonial taxation had not required. In New York, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organized resistance that went beyond petitions. They tore down the home of a British officer. They threatened the royal governor. They forced the resignation of the stamp distributor before he could distribute a single stamp. The Stamp Act was repealed the following year, partly because of American resistance and partly because British merchants were losing money from the colonial boycott of English goods. New York had won the first round, but winning that round did not resolve the underlying question, which was whether the British Parliament had the right to tax the colonies at all without their consent. That question, once raised, could not be unraised, and New York's relationship to it was more complicated than the relationship of most other colonies. The city's economy was deeply entangled with the British imperial system. The merchants who had built New York's prosperity did business with London, insured their cargoes in London, borrowed money from London banks. Many of them had social and family connections to England. Many of them genuinely valued being part of the British Empire, which provided a framework of law and naval protection that made their commercial world function. They wanted the taxes repealed. They were far less certain they wanted independence. This division ran through New York society in ways that defied simple categories. It was not purely a class division. Though wealthy merchants were, on average, more cautious about independence than artisans and laborers, it was not purely an ethnic division. Though New Yorkers of Dutch heritage tended toward different positions than recent arrivals from England, it was a genuine, complex disagreement about what was best for the city and the colony. And it produced political violence in the streets. Neighbor against neighbor. In the years before the war began, when independence was declared in July of 1776, New York was probably the most loyalist of the major colonial cities. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1/3 and close to half of its population either actively supported the British Crown or preferred to remain neutral rather than commit to revolution. These were not cowards or traitors in any simple sense. They were people with real reasons for their position, and the city contained enough of them to make New York's role in the revolution genuinely complicated. The military consequences were swift and severe. George Washington brought his Continental Army to New York in the spring of 1776. Understanding that the city and its harbor were too strategically important to abandon without a fight. He was right about the importance. He was badly outmatched in the fight. In August of 1776, British forces under General William Howe landed on Long Island and executed a flanking maneuver that caught Washington's army off guard and nearly destroyed it entirely. Washington retreated, first to Manhattan, then north, then across New Jersey, in a withdrawal that came within reach of ending the American Revolution before it had fully begun. New York fell to the British in September of 1776 and remained under occupation for the entire duration of the war. 7 years. The longest British occupation of any major American city. During those 7 years, New York was transformed. Loyalist refugees from other colonies poured in seeking British military protection. 2 devastating fires destroyed large portions of the built city. The waterfront was taken over for military purposes. Churches were converted to barracks and prisons. And in the waters off what is now Brooklyn, the prison ships became the war's darkest chapter. The British held captured American soldiers on decommissioned vessels anchored in Wallabout Bay. Picture the hold of a ship designed to carry cargo, now packed with men who had no room to lie down, where the air below decks was so foul that prisoners who had survived battle were dying within weeks of disease and suffocation. Rations were deliberately kept below survival level. Guards ignored the sick. The men who died were rowed ashore at night and buried in the sand of the Brooklyn shoreline with no ceremony and no record of their names. For years after the war, bones washed out of that bank with every tide. Silent evidence of what had happened there. Historians estimate the death toll on those ships at somewhere between 8,000 and 11,000 people. More American deaths than occurred in all the land battles of the Revolution combined. Most of those men have no grave marker. Most of their names were never recorded. They are the largest group of American war dead that history has almost entirely forgotten. When the British finally evacuated in November of 1783, following the Treaty of Paris that ended the war, they took approximately 29,000 Loyalist civilians with them. People who had bet on the British Empire and lost everything. Many went to Canada. Some went to England. They left behind a city that was physically damaged, economically disrupted, and politically transformed. What happened next surprised everyone. Within months of the British evacuation, New York began to rebuild at a pace that seemed almost unreasonable given what it had just been through. Ships returned to the harbor. Merchants reopened their counting houses. The pragmatic New Yorkers who had sat out the war on neither side emerged from their careful neutrality and got back to work. The commercial instincts that had shaped the city from its Dutch founding reasserted themselves as if the occupation had been merely an interruption. And then New York received a gift it had not expected. In April of 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall on Wall Street and was inaugurated as the first President of the United States. New York was the capital of the new nation. The man who had retreated from this city in humiliating defeat 13 years earlier now stood in it as the leader of the country that city had. However reluctantly, helped create, the capital moved to Philadelphia the following year, and then to the permanent federal city on the Potomac that would carry Washington's name. New York's moment as the seat of national government lasted barely 12 months. But what the city took from that moment was not political power. It was something more durable than power. It was the understanding that no matter how badly things went, no matter which side you had backed, no matter how many times the city had been burned or occupied or nearly destroyed, New York was still standing. And if New York was still standing, it could do what it had always done. It could build, and it was about to build something that would make every other American city permanently secondary. Chapter 6. The Erie Canal and the Moment New York became number one. On a July morning in 1817, construction workers broke ground on a ditch in the middle of nowhere, and without fully knowing it, changed the economic history of the United States. The ditch was 363 miles long. It would run from the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo, crossing dense forest, swamps, and a limestone ridge that no engineering project in American history had ever attempted to cut through at that scale. The man who had pushed it through years of political opposition was Governor DeWitt Clinton, a figure of such confident vision that his critics and his admirers both found him slightly exhausting. His critics had taken to calling the project Clinton's Ditch, intending the name as mockery. Clinton used it as a badge of pride. Thomas Jefferson, when asked about the canal, called it a little short of madness. Construction took 8 years. What made it more remarkable was that there were almost no trained engineers in America at the time. The men who built the Erie Canal learned how to build it while they were building it. They invented tools on the job. They developed new techniques for blasting limestone and constructing the 83 locks that would lift and lower boats across the dramatic changes in elevation along the route. They hired thousands of workers, many of them recent Irish immigrants enduring conditions that the canal's promoters preferred not to discuss in their public statements. And they drove the construction forward through winter and summer across terrain that resisted every attempt to move through it quickly. The canal opened in October of 1825. DeWitt Clinton stood on a boat at Buffalo, filled 2 kegs with water from Lake Erie, and traveled the entire length of the canal to New York Harbor. At the ceremony in the harbor, he poured the Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean in a ritual he called the Wedding of the Waters. It was exactly the kind of theatrical gesture that New Yorkers would keep producing for the next 2 centuries. The effects were not gradual. They were immediate, enormous, and they restructured the economic geography of an entire continent. Before the Erie Canal, moving a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City overland cost around $100 and took roughly 3 weeks. After the canal opened, the same journey cost less than $10 and took about 8 days. A price drop of roughly 90% in shipping costs was not a marginal improvement. It was a transformation of the entire logic of where things got made and where they got sold. The agricultural produce of the Great Lakes region, the wheat and corn and timber from Ohio, Indiana, and the territories expanding westward, suddenly had a cheap route to the Atlantic, and the only Atlantic port that route connected to was New York. Other cities understood immediately what had happened to them. Philadelphia had rivers, but no equivalent connection to the interior. Boston was geographically blocked by the mountains of western Massachusetts. Baltimore tried to respond with its own canal and later with a railroad. But by the time any alternative was functional, New York had captured so much of the western trade that catching up was nearly impossible. The numbers tell the story with a clarity that is almost difficult to believe. In 1818, the year after canal construction began, New York handled about 9% of American imports and exports. By 1836, 11 years after the canal opened, that figure had risen to 62%. More than half of everything entering or leaving the United States passed through one port. New York did not just become the largest city in America during this period. It became a different category of city entirely. The population reflected this. In 1820, New York had around 123,000 residents. By 1850, more than 500,000. The city was growing at a rate no American city had ever experienced, pulling in migrants from the American countryside, from Europe, and from every direction a person could arrive from when they decided they needed to go somewhere that was going somewhere. The physical city expanded to meet this growth. Awkwardly and not always thoughtfully, Manhattan, above the old Dutch settlement, had been surveyed and laid out in a grid in 1811, before the canal was even built, in an act of civic planning that was either visionary or presumptuous, depending on how you felt about designating 12,000 rectangular blocks on a largely empty island. The commissioners who designed the grid wrote in their report that they had been influenced in their choice of straight lines and right angles by the fact that such a plan was best suited to the buying, selling, and improving of real estate. There was no mention of beauty, no mention of parks, no mention of what it might feel like to walk through a city of 12,000 identical blocks. Only the logic of commercial efficiency. The wealth generated by the canal did not distribute itself evenly. The merchants who owned the counting houses and the ships and the warehouses along the waterfront accumulated fortunes that made them among the richest people in the country. One man understood the canal better than almost anyone, and he had not built a single foot of it. John Jacob Astor had started as a fur trader in the same Hudson Valley trade routes the Dutch had established 2 centuries earlier. By the time the canal opened, he had already begun pivoting to something more durable than fur. He was buying Manhattan real estate. Specifically, he was buying land uptown, ahead of the city's expansion northward, and waiting for the city to grow to it. In a city growing as fast as New York was growing, land on the path of that growth was not just valuable, it was reliably, predictably, perpetually more valuable with each passing year. Astor bought. He waited. He sold or rented at prices that multiplied his original investment many times over. By his death in 1848, he was worth the equivalent of several $1 billion in today's terms, making him the wealthiest man in America. At the other end of the scale, the workers who loaded and unloaded the ships built the warehouses and drove the carts along the waterfront, lived in conditions that were the mirror image of Astor's brownstone mansion. The neighborhoods north of the old Dutch settlement, particularly the area called the 5 Points, became some of the most densely populated and desperately poor urban environments in the world. Charles Dickens visited the Five Points in 1842 and wrote about it in terms that left his English readers grateful for the relative spaciousness of London's worst slums. This was the contradiction at the heart of New York's explosive growth. The canal, the harbour, the grid, and the commercial genius of the city's merchant class had created something genuinely extraordinary. They had also created conditions in which tens of thousands of people lived in poverty so concentrated and so visible that it was impossible to look away. The question of what to do about that poverty, who was responsible for it, who deserved it, and who could escape it, would drive New York's politics for the next century and a half. It would also create the conditions for the most effective and most corrupt political machine in the history of American democracy. But before that story, there is another wave coming. A wave so large, so sudden, and so desperate that it would change the character of the city more thoroughly than anything since the Dutch first sailed into the harbour. The potato was failing in Ireland, and 1 million people were about to start moving. Chapter 7: Immigration and the City that Absorbed the World. On the first day of January, 1892, a 17-year-old girl from County Cork, Ireland became the first person to be processed through the newly opened immigration station on Ellis Island. Her name was Annie Moore. She had crossed the Atlantic with her 2 younger brothers to join their parents who had emigrated to New York 2 years earlier. The crossing had taken 12 days under conditions that a later government report would describe as appalling. Passengers packed into the lower decks of ships with minimal ventilation, inadequate food, and sanitation arrangements that reflected the low regard in which the shipping companies held the people they were carrying. Annie Moore stepped off the boat, walked through the processing hall, and received from the immigration officials a $10 gold coin, a commemorative gesture for being the first arrival at the new station. She was then free to leave. She walked out into the streets of Lower Manhattan and was on her own. Annie Moore's story is, in miniature, the story of the 12 million people who would follow her through Ellis Island over the next 32 years. The arrival, the processing, the brief official moment, and then the city, enormous and indifferent and full of possibility, waiting on the other side of the door. To understand what those arrivals were coming from, you need to understand what the Great Famine had done to Ireland, because the Irish wave that preceded Ellis Island set the template for everything that followed. The Great Famine had been destroying Ireland since 1845. When a water mold called Phytophthora infestans attacked the potato crop across the island, the potato was not merely a staple food in rural Ireland. For the poorest third of the population, it was essentially the only food. When the crop failed, not once but repeatedly over the following years, the consequences were catastrophic in a way that the word famine cannot adequately capture. Between 1845 and 1852, approximately 1 million people died of starvation and disease in Ireland. Another 1 million emigrated in those same years. The population of the island fell by roughly 25% in less than a decade. The majority of those who left came to North America, and the majority of those who came to North America came through New York. They arrived in numbers that overwhelmed every system the city had for receiving them. Boarding houses run by men who preyed on newly arrived immigrants waited at the bottom of every gangplank to steer bewildered arrivals toward lodgings that were overpriced, overcrowded, and frequently dangerous. The city government had no mechanism for processing or supporting tens of thousands of people arriving each year. The private charities that tried to fill the gap were not remotely adequate to the scale of the need. The Irish settled in the most affordable neighborhoods, which meant the most crowded and deteriorated ones. The 5 points: the waterfront neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, the areas of Brooklyn near the docks. These became densely Irish communities almost overnight. Families of 8 and 10 people shared single rooms. Buildings designed for one family held 5 or 6. Cellars that had been used for storage became living quarters. The mortality rates in these neighborhoods reflected the physical conditions honestly and without mercy. But the Irish came anyway, because the alternative was worse. Within a generation, the Irish had transformed the city's politics, its labor force, its religious life, and its cultural character in ways that proved permanent. The Catholic Church, which had been a minor institution in what had been a predominantly Protestant city, became one of the most powerful organizations in New York, building parishes, schools, and hospitals at a pace that reflected the scale of the Irish arrival. The Church provided community, identity, and institutional support to people who had nothing else to anchor themselves to in a strange city. The Irish also provided the muscle for the construction projects reshaping New York in the middle decades of the century. Irish laborers built the aqueduct that brought fresh water from Westchester County. They built the piers and warehouses along the expanded waterfront. They dug the foundations of buildings going up across Lower Manhattan. The physical infrastructure of 19th century New York was built substantially by men who had arrived with nothing and were being paid barely enough to survive. The Irish story was the first act of a drama that would play out again and again over the following 70 years, with different groups arriving in different waves, each one transforming the city and being transformed by it. The Germans came in large numbers in the 1840s and 1850s, many fleeing the failed revolutions of 1848. They settled primarily in an area of the Lower East Side that became known as Kleindeutschland, or Little Germany, a neighborhood so thoroughly German that a resident could spend their entire life within it speaking only German, reading German newspapers, attending German churches and theaters and beer halls. At its peak in the 1860s, Kleindeutschland was home to more Germans than any city in the world outside Germany itself. The Italians came, beginning in the 1870s and accelerating dramatically through the 1880s and 90s. Most came from the south of Italy and from Sicily, regions economically devastated by the changes following Italian unification. They came speaking dialects that were sometimes mutually unintelligible, from villages where family and local loyalty ran deeper than any national identity. They created neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan, in East Harlem, in Brooklyn, that maintained the village social structures they had brought with them, transplanted improbably onto the grid of an American city. The Eastern European Jews came in the greatest numbers of all, driven by the pogroms that swept through Jewish communities of Russia, Poland, and Romania in the 1880s and 90s. Between 1880 and 1924, approximately 2 million Jewish immigrants arrived in New York. They packed into the Lower East Side in densities that by 1900 made it among the most densely populated places on Earth. Families sharing 2- and 3-room apartments, taking in boarders to make rent, working in garment factories and push-cart markets and small shops that ran from early morning to late at night. One of those workers was a 17-year-old named Clara Lemlich, who had arrived from what is now Ukraine in 1906 and was working 12 to 14-hour days at a garment factory for wages that left almost nothing at the end of the week. In November of 1909, she stood up at a meeting of thousands of garment workers at Cooper Union and gave a short speech in Yiddish that became one of the most consequential labor addresses in American history. She said, "I am a working girl, one of those striking against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in generalities. What we are here for is to decide whether or not to strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be called now. The audience voted yes. The strike that followed, known as the Uprising of the 20,000, involved between 20,000 and 40,000 workers, mostly young immigrant women. And it laid the groundwork for the labor protections that would eventually reshape working conditions across the American garment industry. Annie Moore had arrived with nothing. Clara Lemlich had arrived with nothing. Within years of their arrivals, each of them had helped change the city in ways that lasted. The diversity this wave of immigration produced was real, but it had a shadow that the ladder metaphor tends to obscure. Each new wave of arrivals faced hostility and organized resistance from those already there. The Irish faced signs saying no Irish need apply. The Chinese who arrived in the late 19th century faced the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first law in American history to ban immigration on the basis of national origin, which consigned those already in New York to a Chinatown that was legally and socially isolated from the rest of the city. And underneath all of it, the people with the longest history in New York and the least institutional protection were the black New Yorkers whose ancestors had been enslaved in the Dutch and English colonial periods. Free black communities had existed here since the 17th century. By the 19th century, they were being squeezed from multiple directions. By the hostility of white working-class immigrants who saw them as labor competition, by legal structures that restricted their rights, and by periodic explosions of violence like the draft riots of 1863. In July of that year, a 4-day rampage by white working-class men, largely Irish, tore through black neighborhoods in Manhattan. At least 100 people were killed. With some estimates running considerably higher, the rioters burned the colored orphan asylum on Fifth Avenue while more than 200 children were still inside. The children escaped through the back before the building was destroyed. But the institution they had lived in was gone. The men who burned it had themselves arrived in this country with nothing, fleeing starvation. They directed their rage at the people below them on the social ladder rather than at the people above them who had designed the system. It was a pattern that the city would see again. By 1920, the immigration wave that had transformed New York over the previous 80 years was coming to an end. The Immigration Act of 1924 established national origin quotas that dramatically reduced arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe and cut off almost entirely immigration from Asia. The city that had been built by waves of newcomers had decided, at the national level, that it had enough newcomers, but the city those immigrants had built was already in place. The languages, the food, the music, the political culture, the specific New York quality of restless, argumentative, perpetually striving energy, None of that was going anywhere. And running through all of it, touching every neighborhood and every wave of arrivals and every generation of people trying to get a foothold in this city, was a political organization that understood something about power that reformers and idealists kept failing to grasp. It understood that people who are struggling do not want a sermon. They want a job. Chapter 8. Tammany Hall, the mob, and the machine that ran New York. There is a building that stood on 14th Street in Manhattan for decades. And if you knew what happened inside it, you would understand more about how American cities actually work than most political science textbooks will ever tell you. It was called Tammany Hall, and for roughly 100 years, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th, it was the real government of New York City, not the mayor's office, not the city council, not the courts. Tammany Hall. The organization had been founded in 1789 as a fraternal society, one of dozens of such clubs that existed in early American cities. For its first few decades, it was unremarkable. What transformed it into something unique in American political history was the arrival of the Irish. When Irish immigrants poured into New York in the 1840s and 1850s in numbers that overwhelmed the city's capacity to absorb them, the existing political establishment had nothing to offer them. It was largely Protestant, largely Anglo-American, and largely indifferent to the suffering of Catholic immigrants. It regarded with a mixture of pity and contempt. Tammany Hall had something to offer them. It had jobs. It had help with rent when the landlord was threatening eviction. It had a lawyer when someone in the family got arrested. It had a turkey at Thanksgiving and a bucket of coal in winter when there was no money for either. In exchange for these things, Tammany asked for one thing: your vote and the vote of everyone you knew. The transaction was explicit. And it worked because it was honest in a way that the reformers who opposed Tammany were often not. The reformers offered better government in the abstract. Tammany offered help you could use today. For a family living in a 2-room tenement on the Lower East Side with 6 children and a father who had just lost his job on the docks, the abstract was not very useful. The help was, the system Tammany built was a masterpiece of organizational engineering. The city was divided into assembly districts. Each district was controlled by a ward boss, a man who knew every family in his territory, who knew who needed work, who had a son in trouble with the police, who had a daughter who needed a hospital bed, who had just arrived from County Cork and needed someone to explain how things worked in this city. The ward boss was the interface between the immigrant community and the machinery of city government. He was accessible in a way that the mayor was not. He was useful in a way that the reformers were not, and in exchange for being useful, he collected something that was worth more than money in the democracy that was taking shape in 19th century America. He collected loyalty, the man who became the symbol of everything Tammany represented, the figure whose name became synonymous with municipal corruption across the entire country, was William McGeer Tweed, known to history simply as Boss Tweed. Tweed rose to dominance in the 1860s. At the moment when New York was undergoing a construction boom that poured enormous sums of public money into the building of courthouses, streets, parks, and public buildings, the opportunities for corruption that this boom presented were not subtle, and Tweed did not treat them subtly. Contractors who received city contracts paid kickbacks to Tammany. Suppliers who provided materials inflated their invoices and split the difference with the machine. A courthouse that should have cost $250,000 ended up costing $13 million, with the difference distributed among Tweed and his associates in a scheme so brazen that it was eventually impossible to conceal. Historians who have studied the period estimate that Tweed and his ring stole somewhere between $30 million and $100 million from the city of New York, a range that reflects how thoroughly the records were manipulated. In today's terms, even the lower end of that estimate represents hundreds of millions of dollars. Tweed was eventually brought down not by a reform political movement, but by a series of cartoons. Thomas Nast, a cartoonist working for Harper's Weekly, drew Tweed repeatedly over several years with an unflinching savagery that made the boss's face and his crimes recognizable to hundreds of thousands of readers who might never read a political analysis but could understand a picture. Tweed reportedly said that he did not care what the papers wrote about him because his constituents could not read. But those damn pictures were killing him. He fled to Spain after his conviction. He was identified there by a Spanish official who recognized him from a Nast cartoon. He died in a New York jail in 1878. Tammany Hall kept going for another 70 years. The reason Tammany survived Tweed and survived the reform movements that periodically swept it from power only to watch it return within a few election cycles, was that the underlying need it met did not go away. The city kept growing. New waves of immigrants kept arriving. Each wave needed the same things the Irish had needed 40 years earlier. The later bosses were in some ways more sophisticated than Tweed. Charles F. Murphy, who led the organization from 1902 to 1924, was the most capable political operator in Tammany's history. A man who understood that the organization's long-term survival depended on occasionally delivering genuinely good government and occasionally backing genuinely talented people. It was Murphy who recognized the potential of a young state assemblyman from the Lower East Side named Alfred E. Smith and backed his career all the way to the governorship of New York and eventually to the Democratic nomination for president in 1928. Smith was the son of Irish immigrants, raised in the tenements below the Brooklyn Bridge. Educated not in universities but in the streets and meeting halls of Tammany's Manhattan, he was also genuinely competent, genuinely concerned with the conditions of working people, and responsible for labor reforms that improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. This was the complexity that the simple narrative of Tammany as pure corruption always missed. The machine was corrupt. It was also functional. It delivered services. It incorporated immigrants. It provided a ladder, however crooked, from the bottom of the city to positions of real power. The men it produced were often venal, but they were not always useless, and they understood the city they governed in ways that the reform candidates who periodically replaced them often did not. Running parallel to Tammany, and increasingly intertwined with the city's commercial and political life from the 1880s onward, was another form of organized power that operated entirely outside the formal structures of government. The same waves of immigration that had built Tammany's political machine had also brought with them the social structures and criminal traditions of the places people had come from. The Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe brought figures who had operated as enforcers and fixers in the communities of Russia and Poland. The Italian immigrants from Sicily and the southern mainland brought with them the cultural framework of the mafia, a system of organized criminal authority that had developed partly as a response to centuries of ineffective and corrupt formal government. In New York, these traditions encountered a city whose official corruption created enormous opportunities for unofficial criminal enterprise. The police department, thoroughly penetrated by Tammany influence, was available for purchase at established rates. The line between the political machine, the police department, and organized crime was not a line at all. It was a spectrum, and people moved along it fluidly in both directions. The consolidation of Italian-American organized crime into the structure that became known as the American Mafia happened in New York over the 1920s and 30s, shaped by two forces that arrived almost simultaneously. The first was Prohibition, which began in 1920 and created overnight the largest illegal market in American history. The second was a brutal internal conflict known as the Castellamarese War, a series of murders in 1930 and 1931 that reshaped the criminal landscape of the entire city. The man who emerged from that war as the dominant figure in New York organized crime was Charles Luciano, known as Lucky Luciano. What he built was less a traditional mafia family in the Sicilian sense than a modern business organization. Luciano organized the criminal enterprises of New York into 5 families, established rules for resolving disputes without the kind of public violence that attracted police attention, and created a national commission of crime bosses to coordinate activities across cities. He understood that the greatest threat to organized crime was not law enforcement. It was disorganization. Luciano was eventually convicted and imprisoned in 1936, largely through the efforts of a prosecutor named Thomas Dewey, who would later run for president twice. But the structure Luciano had built survived him, and the 5 families he had organized would remain a dominant force in New York's underworld for decades to come. What eventually weakened both Tammany and organized crime was not the reform movements that periodically threw them into temporary retreat. It was change in the city itself. The New Deal of the 1930s created federal social welfare programs that began to do some of what Tammany had done, reducing the machine's monopoly on help. The LaGuardia administration, which ran the city from 1934 to 1945, restructured enough of the city's civil service to make it harder for the machine to simply buy back the offices it lost. And the neighborhoods that had sustained Tammany's immigrant base were moving. The Irish families of the Lower East Side had moved to the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens. The next generation of New Yorkers was not living in the dense tenement blocks where the ward boss knew everyone by name. They were living in new apartment buildings, in different boroughs, in communities that were less concentrated and less dependent on the machine's specific services. The world that had made Tammany Hall necessary was passing. What was not passing was the city it had helped build. 8 million people from everywhere on earth, speaking every language, carrying every tradition, competing and arguing and hustling with a ferocity that no other city on the planet could match. Tammany had not created that energy. It had simply been the first organization smart enough to channel it. Now, something else was about to channel it in a way that would last far longer than any political machine ever had. It was happening in Harlem, and it had nothing to do with votes. Chapter 9. The Harlem Renaissance and the Black Capital of the World. In 1920, Harlem was one of the most elegant residential neighborhoods in New York City. The brownstones were well maintained. The streets were tree-lined. The residents were white, middle class, and largely convinced that things would stay that way. 5 years later, Harlem was the cultural capital of Black America, the most important concentration of Black artistic, intellectual, and political talent anywhere on earth had gathered on a few square miles of Upper Manhattan, and what it was producing was beginning to change American culture in ways that nobody, not even the people doing it, fully understood yet. Nobody planned this. It began with a real estate collapse. Harlem in the 1880s had been developed by speculators who built elegant brownstones and row houses on tree-lined streets, anticipating that elevated railroad lines extending up Manhattan would bring affluent white New Yorkers north from the crowded downtown. For a while, that is exactly what happened. Then the real estate market collapsed. Overbuilding in the late 1890s had produced far more housing than the market could absorb. Landlords who had borrowed heavily to finance construction found themselves with vacant buildings and mortgage payments they could not meet. They were desperate enough to rent to anyone who could pay. A Black real estate agent named Philip Payton recognized the opportunity and moved on it. Payton approached white landlords with vacant Harlem buildings and offered to fill them with Black tenants who would pay slightly higher rents than the white tenants the landlords had failed to attract. The white landlords, facing foreclosure, accepted. Payton organized a company to manage these buildings and began recruiting Black families from overcrowded neighborhoods elsewhere in Manhattan. The movement of Black families into Harlem accelerated through the 1900s and 1910s. White families moved out as Black families moved in. A pattern of residential succession driven by the racist assumption that Black neighbors reduced property values, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy because white flight itself caused the values to drop. By 1914, large sections of Harlem were predominantly Black, and the neighborhood was drawing migrants not just from other parts of Manhattan, but from across the country. The Great Migration was underway. Between 1910 and 1970, approximately 6 million Black Americans moved from the rural South to the urban North. Driven by the brutal conditions of the Jim Crow South and the pull of industrial employment in northern cities, New York received a substantial portion of this migration, and much of what arrived in New York settled in Harlem. What gathered in Harlem during the 1910s and 1920s was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable concentrations of creative talent in American cultural history. The people who came were not just workers seeking employment. Though many were, they were writers, artists, musicians, political organizers, and intellectuals who came to Harlem because Harlem had become the acknowledged capital of Black America. The place where the conversation about what it meant to be Black in the 20th century was being conducted at the highest level. The intellectual framework had been laid by W.E.B. Du Bois, the scholar and activist who had co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. Du Bois had been arguing for years that Black Americans needed to claim their full humanity and their full place in American intellectual and cultural life, not by imitating white American culture, but by building and celebrating a culture that was distinctly and proudly their own. His magazine, The Crisis, reached 100,000 subscribers at its peak and served as a forum for Black writers, artists, and thinkers who had almost no other mainstream outlet. Marcus Garvey brought a different vision. a Jamaican-born organizer who arrived in New York in 1916, Garvey built the Universal Negro Improvement Association into a mass movement with chapters across the country and internationally, where Du Bois argued for integration and full participation in American life. Garvey argued for black economic independence and a return to Africa as the only real solution to the condition of black people in a white-dominated world. His message resonated with a population that had been told repeatedly that America had no place for them. Historians estimate the movement's active membership at its peak at somewhere between 2 million and 4 million people, making it the largest black mass movement in American history up to that point. But the aspect of the Harlem Renaissance that proved most durable, that reached most deeply into American culture and changed it most permanently, was not political, it was the music. Jazz had come up from New Orleans, carried north by musicians who followed the Great Migration and found in the clubs and dance halls of Harlem an audience that was ready for it. What happened to jazz in Harlem in these years was an acceleration and a sophistication that transformed it from a regional sound into the dominant musical language of the 20th century. Duke Ellington arrived in New York in 1923 and began a residency at the Cotton Club in 1927 that would last for years. The Cotton Club was itself a paradox that captured much of the complexity of the Harlem Renaissance. It featured black performers for white audiences in a neighborhood that was predominantly black. In a club that did not admit black patrons. The best black musicians in the world performed there for audiences who would not have sat next to them on a subway car. And those performances were broadcast on national radio, carrying the music of Harlem into living rooms across the country and eventually around the world. The literature of the Renaissance was equally extraordinary. Langston Hughes, who came to Harlem in the mid-1920s and wrote that he felt like he had come home, though he had never been there before, became one of the most important American poets of the 20th century, writing in a vernacular rooted in the black experience with a directness and skill that no poet had brought to it before. Zora Neale Hurston, trained as an anthropologist and gifted as a fiction writer, documented the folk culture of the Black South with scholarly precision and literary beauty that her contemporaries often undervalued and that later generations recognized as foundational. Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, and County Cullen were producing work in these same years that would have represented a remarkable cultural output from any community of any background anywhere on earth. The visual artists were equally present. Aaron Douglas developed a style that drew on African visual traditions and Art Deco influences to create images that were simultaneously modern and rooted in black American experience. His murals appeared in the Harlem YMCA, in university libraries, in the pages of magazines and books across the country, making the invisible visible, insisting on the humanity and complexity of people that the broader American culture had spent generations trying to reduce to a caricature. The Harlem Renaissance was not a period of economic prosperity for most of the people living in Harlem. The neighborhood was poor. The tenements were overcrowded. Rents were higher per square foot than in comparable white neighborhoods because black tenants had fewer housing options and landlords knew it. Discrimination in employment meant that the black residents of Harlem were largely shut out of the better-paying industrial and commercial jobs that were lifting other immigrant communities into the middle class. The Great Depression, which arrived with the stock market crash of October 1929, hit Harlem with a severity that exceeded its impact on most white neighborhoods. Unemployment reached catastrophic levels by 1932. The cultural institutions that had flourished through the 20s contracted severely, and many key figures left the neighborhood. What remained? What could not be taken away by a financial collapse or a depression or the indifference of the larger white city surrounding it? Was the cultural legacy, the music, the literature, the art. The political thought that had emerged from Harlem had already changed what American culture was capable of and what it was required to acknowledge. The Harlem Renaissance had demonstrated with a clarity that could not be argued away that Black Americans had a cultural tradition of extraordinary depth and originality, that their contributions to American life were not marginal additions to a white mainstream, but foundational elements of something genuinely shared. That demonstration did not end racism. It did not open the doors of the Cotton Club to black patrons. It did not integrate the police department or the building trades or the real estate market. But it changed what was arguable. It changed what could be said out loud and what could no longer be said without shame. And it sent something out into the world from those Harlem streets and clubs and meeting rooms that could not be called back. The music went everywhere. The words went everywhere. The ideas went everywhere. The world that received them was changed by them in ways that are still unfolding. But while Harlem was doing the most creatively important work in the city, the financial machinery that had made New York the center of the world was about to experience a failure so catastrophic that it would reach into every neighborhood, every family, every life in the city and beyond. The stock market was about to take everything down with it. Chapter 10: The Crash, the New Deal, and the City That Nearly Died. On the morning of October 24th, 1929, a Thursday that would enter financial history as Black Thursday, the traders who arrived at the New York Stock Exchange on Broad Street found something they had never seen before. The market was not opening in the ordinary way. Prices on the ticker tape were falling before the opening bell had finished ringing. Within the first 30 minutes, the volume of sell orders was so far beyond anything the exchange's systems had been designed to handle that the ticker tape fell behind by over an hour. Traders were making decisions based on prices that had already changed dramatically by the time they received them. The floor of the exchange, which on normal days operated with a disciplined chaos that long-time participants found almost musical, had become something closer to controlled panic. By midday, a group of the most powerful bankers in New York had gathered at the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company at 23 Wall Street, directly across from the exchange. They pooled their resources and began buying stocks at above-market prices. A direct intervention designed to signal confidence and stop the freefall. It worked for 4 days. On Monday, October 28th, the market fell again, worse than Thursday. On Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, it fell again, in a collapse so severe that the losses in a single day exceeded the entire federal budget of the United States government. The intervention of the bankers, so effective in 1907 when J.P. Morgan himself had performed a similar rescue, was simply insufficient against the scale of what was now happening. What had happened was not a single event with a single cause. It was the rupture of a bubble built through the entire decade of the 1920s, fed by easy credit, by speculation that had detached stock prices from any relationship to the actual earnings of the companies they represented. and by a financial culture in which the assumption that markets only went up had become so deeply embedded that almost nobody in a position of authority had seriously modeled what would happen if they went down. New York had been the center of that bubble. The stock exchange was here. The banks that had extended the credit were here. The brokerage houses and the financial newspapers that had promoted the frenzy were here. And when the bubble burst, the consequences radiated outward from this city to every corner of the country and eventually the world. But they hit New York first and in concentrated form. By 1931, the effects had moved from Wall Street into every neighborhood in the city. Unemployment was rising toward levels not seen in living memory. The breadlines that appeared on the streets of Lower Manhattan and in the immigrant neighborhoods of the Bronx and Brooklyn were not composed only of people who had always been poor. They were composed of workers who had had jobs, families who had been managing, men who had arrived at middle age with some security and found it gone in a matter of months. The apple sellers became the symbol of the Depression in New York. At the peak, over 6,000 men stood on street corners selling apples for 5 cents apiece. They were there because the International Apple Shippers Association had come up with the idea of selling surplus apple stock to unemployed men on credit, and the men had taken the deal because it was better than nothing. But they were also there because they made the Depression impossible to ignore and impossible to pretend was happening somewhere else. The city government under Mayor Jimmy Walker was spectacularly ill-equipped to respond. Walker was a Tammany politician, charming and corrupt in roughly equal measure, who had spent his mayoralty attending nightclub openings and leaving actual governance to subordinates of varying quality. He resigned in 1932 under the weight of investigations that had found evidence of personal corruption so extensive that even Tammany could not protect him. His replacement was Fiorello LaGuardia. LaGuardia is one of the most genuinely remarkable figures in the history of American urban government. His father was Italian. His mother was Jewish. He had grown up partly in Arizona, worked as a consular official in Europe, put himself through law school, and served in Congress before running for mayor. He spoke 7 languages. He was short, energetic, loud, and possessed of a moral seriousness about the condition of the city's poor that was unusual in a politician of any era. He took office in January of 1934 and immediately began doing things that New York City mayors had not previously done. He fired Tammany appointees across the city government and replaced them with people chosen for competence rather than political loyalty, a practice so unusual in the context of New York City politics that observers treated it as a radical innovation. He picked up a sledgehammer and personally smashed slot machines confiscated from illegal gambling operations. A gesture that was more theater than policy, but that communicated something about his intentions that his constituents found genuinely reassuring. He hired Robert Moses as Parks Commissioner. And that decision opened a chapter of New York's physical development so consequential and so complicated that its effects are still being argued about today. Moses held at various times the titles of Parks Commissioner, Construction Coordinator, and Chairman of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, among a dozen other positions across city and state government. He was never elected to anything. He wielded his power through the authorities he controlled, which had independent financing through bond revenues and were therefore not subject to the normal budget processes that gave elected officials leverage over appointed ones. At the peak of his influence, Robert Moses had more practical power over the physical development of New York than any elected official, including the mayor. What Moses built was staggering in scale. More than 700 playgrounds, hundreds of miles of parkways, Jones Beach, designed as a public recreation facility of a quality that had previously been available only to the wealthy. The Triborough Bridge, connecting Manhattan, the Bronx, and Queens in a piece of infrastructure that transformed the movement of people and goods through the entire region. The Cross Bronx Expressway, Lincoln Center, the United Nations headquarters site. What Moses destroyed was equally staggering, and Robert Caro documented it in meticulous detail in his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, The Power Broker, published in 1974. Moses built the Cross Bronx Expressway through the middle of established Bronx neighborhoods, displacing 60,000 people with a contempt for their objections that he never bothered to disguise. Caro's research found evidence suggesting that Moses deliberately designed his parkway overpasses with clearances too low for buses, the primary transportation of poor and black New Yorkers. In order to limit their access to the parks and beaches he was building for the white middle class, Moses was, by the record of his own decisions and his own statements, a man whose vision of what New York should be had no place in it for the people at the bottom of the city's social order. The federal money that made much of the LaGuardia era's construction possible came from the New Deal programs of Franklin Roosevelt's administration in Washington. Roosevelt, who had been governor of New York before the presidency, understood the city's needs in ways that helped align federal resources with the most acute local problems. The Works Progress Administration employed not just construction laborers but writers, artists, musicians, and theater workers, producing a body of cultural work that documented American life in the Depression years with a thoroughness and quality that has never been replicated. Then came a moment that changed everything again. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the United States entered the Second World War. For New York, the shift was almost immediate. The shipyards of Brooklyn, which had been operating below capacity through the Depression years, suddenly had more orders than they could fill. The factories of the outer boroughs retooled for military production. The port handled a volume of military cargo that dwarfed anything in its commercial history. Unemployment, the defining economic reality of the city for a decade, essentially disappeared. The city that emerged from the Second World War in 1945 was richer, more confident, and physically improved by the New Deal construction. It was poised for a post-war expansion that seemed, in the optimism of victory, without limit. That optimism was not wrong exactly, but it missed the forces already in motion that would, over the following 3 decades, bring the most powerful city in the world to the edge of complete collapse. The middle class was about to leave, and when it did, it would take with it the tax base, the political stability, and the sense of shared investment in the city's future that everything else depended on. Chapter 11. Bankruptcy, the Bronx Burns, and the Birth of Hip Hop. In October of 1975, the city of New York sent a letter to its creditors informing them that it could not make its scheduled debt payments. New York City, the financial capital of the world, the city that housed the Stock Exchange and the Federal Reserve Bank and the headquarters of every major American financial institution, was broke. The story of how New York got from the triumph of 1945 to the bankruptcy of 1975 is one of the most instructive urban stories of the 20th century, because the forces that destroyed the city's finances were not external catastrophes. They were the logical consequences of decisions made by people who believed they were doing the right thing, compounded by decisions made by people who knew they were doing the wrong thing and did it anyway. The first force was the highway. Robert Moses had built his parkways and expressways with the automobile in mind, and the automobile responded to the invitation. The Federal Highway Program, authorized by the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, made it possible to drive from a house in the suburbs to a job in the city with a speed and convenience that had not previously existed. The suburbs of Long Island, Westchester, New Jersey, and Connecticut, which Moses's own parkways had helped develop, were now accessible to anyone with a car and a steady paycheck. The middle class left between 1950 and 1970. New York City lost approximately 800,000 white middle-class residents to the suburbs. They were replaced, in roughly equal numbers, by Black and Puerto Rican migrants from the South and the Caribbean, people who were poorer on average, who faced more discrimination in the labor market, and who arrived precisely as the industrial jobs that had previously offered a path into the middle class were beginning to leave the city. The second force was deindustrialization. The factories and shipyards and warehouses that had employed hundreds of thousands of working-class New Yorkers for generations were closing or moving. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, which had employed over 70,000 workers during the Second World War, was decommissioned in 1966. The garment industry was moving its production to lower-wage locations. The manufacturing that had given the outer boroughs their economic identity was disappearing, and nothing was replacing it at the same scale. The people left behind required more services from the city government, more welfare assistance, more public housing, more hospital care, more everything. The mayor who dominated this period, John Lindsay, who served from 1966 to 1973, was a liberal Republican from the Upper East Side who genuinely believed in the city's obligation to its poorest residents and who expanded the social safety net at a pace that the city's revenues could not sustain. He also faced a series of municipal labor strikes that he resolved by giving the unions wage increases the city could not afford. Financed by borrowing. The borrowing became structural. The city began using short-term loans not to cover temporary cash flow gaps, but to pay for ongoing operating expenses. It was the municipal equivalent of paying your rent with a credit card, a practice that works until the card is full. By the mid-1970s, New York had accumulated so much short-term debt that it was borrowing new money simply to pay the interest on old money. The crisis came in the spring of 1975, when the banks that had been buying the city's short-term notes announced that they would not buy any more. They had looked at the books and decided that New York City was no longer creditworthy. The city could not roll over its debt. It could not meet its payroll. Governor Hugh Carey assembled an emergency response that created new oversight bodies, imposed austerity on the city government, and eventually secured a federal loan guarantee after President Gerald Ford had initially refused to help. The New York Daily News captured Ford's initial position in one of the most famous newspaper headlines in American history. Across the front page, in large capital letters, it read, "Ford to City, drop dead." Ford had not actually said those words. But the sentiment was accurate enough that the headline has never been forgotten. And Ford is remembered in New York to this day primarily for a statement he never made. The austerity that followed was real and painful. The city laid off tens of thousands of municipal workers. It closed firehouses. It cut library hours and reduced sanitation services. Tuition was introduced at the City University of New York, which had been free since its founding. The parks went unmaintained. The subways fell into a state of physical decay that made them a source of daily dread for the millions of people who had no choice but to use them. And in the Bronx, the fires started. The burning of the South Bronx in the late 1970s is one of the most documented urban disasters in American history, and one of the most misunderstood. It was not random. It was not simply poverty expressing itself as destruction. It was the consequence of a specific chain of decisions and economic incentives that produced a rational, if catastrophic, logic for destruction. The neighborhoods of the South Bronx had been declining since Moses built the Cross-Bronx Expressway through the middle of them in the late 1950s and early 60s, displacing tens of thousands of residents and destroying the community fabric of neighborhoods that had been stable and functioning for generations. The residents who remained were poorer. The housing stock was older, and the landlords who owned the buildings faced a specific calculation. In a neighborhood where property values were falling and tenants were poor, a landlord in the late 1970s could make more money by burning the building down and collecting the insurance than by continuing to maintain it. The fire department knew it. The city government knew it. The insurance companies kept writing the policies anyway. Between 1970 and 1980, the South Bronx lost approximately 40% of its housing stock to fire and abandonment. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble and empty lots. The aerial footage broadcast during the 1977 World Series, when a television news helicopter covering the game panned across the burning Bronx, and the announcer said simply, "There it is, ladies and gentlemen. The Bronx is burning," captured a level of urban destruction that looked like photographs of bombed European cities from the Second World War. The people living in the South Bronx during these years were not waiting for someone to save them. They were building something. In the community centers and the parks and the apartment buildings that had not yet burned, a group of young people were developing a set of artistic and musical practices that would become the most globally influential cultural movement to emerge from New York since jazz. Hip-hop was born in the South Bronx in the early 1970s, in conditions of poverty and institutional abandonment that its founders later described with a matter-of-factness that is more devastating than any amount of dramatic emphasis. The moment most often cited as a starting point is a back-to-school party held in August of 1973 in a recreation room in a building in the West Bronx. The DJ at that party was a teenager named Clive Campbell, who had grown up in Jamaica before his family moved to the Bronx and who performed under the name DJ Kool Herc. What Herc did that night, using 2 turntables and a technique he had developed of isolating and extending the percussion break sections of funk and soul records, created something new. The young people in that room responded to it in a way that told him immediately he had found something real. What grew from that night was not just a musical genre. It was a complete cultural system with 4 distinct elements: DJing, the turntable technique that Herc pioneered and that Grandmaster Flash and others would develop into a sophisticated art form, MCing. The vocal performance over the music that began as crowd interaction and evolved into the lyrical complexity of rap. Breakdancing. The athletic dance style that developed in response to the breakbeats Herc was isolating. And graffiti writing, the visual art practice that was simultaneously decorating and defacing the surfaces of the deteriorating city. Each element was a response to the specific conditions of the South Bronx in the 1970s. In a community with no resources and no expectation from the larger society of anything except continued neglect, young people had created a culture from the materials at hand. Turntables were cheaper than instruments. Spray paint was available. The walls and the subway cars were there. The subway cars became a traveling gallery for the early graffiti movement. The writers, as they called themselves, painted the cars that ran through every borough, so that a piece of work done in the Bronx would travel to Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan, visible to millions of people who had no idea what they were looking at or where it had come from. The commercial breakthrough came in 1979, when a group called the Sugar Hill Gang recorded a song called Rapper's Delight. It sold millions of copies worldwide and introduced the sound to a national and then international audience that had no idea it existed. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five released The Message in 1982, a record that applied the energy of early hip-hop to a direct and unsparing description of life in the South Bronx. It was a document as much as a song, and it reached people around the world who had never been within 1,000 miles of the Bronx, but recognized in it a truth about poverty and abandonment that they had not heard expressed with that kind of precision before. While hip-hop was being born in the Bronx, another kind of rebirth was happening downtown. The fiscal crisis had produced an unintended consequence for the lower neighborhoods of Manhattan. Rents had fallen. In Soho, in Tribeca, in the neighborhoods around the old garment district. Buildings that had housed manufacturing operations now sat largely empty. Artists moved in, because artists are reliably the first people to colonize cheap space in a declining city. Jean-Michel Basquiat, who had started as a graffiti writer tagging under the name Samo in the streets of Lower Manhattan, became within a few years one of the most celebrated painters in the world. Keith Haring was drawing in chalk on the black paper covering empty advertising spaces in the subway, creating an iconographic language so clear and so energetic that it moved from the subway walls to galleries to the permanent collections of major museums in a span of years that compressed a normal artistic career to a fraction of its usual length. The energy was real. The creativity was real. But a shadow was falling over it. In 1981, the Centers for Disease Control published a brief report noting an unusual cluster of immune deficiency cases among gay men in Los Angeles. By the end of that year, similar clusters had been identified in New York and San Francisco. The disease that would be named Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS, had arrived, and it was about to devastate the communities at the center of New York's downtown cultural renaissance. Between 1981 and the mid-1990s, AIDS killed more than 50,000 New Yorkers. The losses fell with particular severity on communities that already had complicated relationships with the city's institutional power structures. Communities that the city government was slow to acknowledge and slower to help. The activist group ACT UP founded in New York in 1987, turned the city's streets into a stage for the most confrontational and ultimately effective public health advocacy in American history, shaming the government into action through a combination of strategic disruption and profound moral clarity. The AIDS crisis and the crack cocaine epidemic that swept through the city's poorest neighborhoods simultaneously in the mid-1980s together produced the most sustained period of social stress New York had experienced. Since the Depression, crime reached levels in the late 1980s that made the city's reputation for danger feel like an objective fact rather than an exaggeration. By 1990, New York was recording approaching 2,000 homicides a year. And yet the city was not dying. It had looked like it was dying in 1975. It had looked like it was dying during the blackout of 1977, when the lights went out across the entire city for 25 hours and produced looting on a scale that shocked the country. It had looked like it was dying through the AIDS crisis and the crack epidemic and the murder rates that seemed to have no flaw. But underneath all of it, the financial sector was quietly rebuilding. Wall Street had been deregulated and transformed in ways that were generating new wealth at a scale that would eventually change the entire economic character of Manhattan. The artists who had moved into cheap lofts in the late 70s were being followed by galleries and restaurants, and eventually by the professionals who wanted to live near the galleries and restaurants. The city that had been written off was accumulating, without fully knowing it. The conditions for a revival that would be as dramatic as any of its previous reinventions. And then, in a way nobody had predicted, the crime stopped. Chapter 12. The Revival, the Skyline, and the Day Everything Changed. In 1993, a transit police officer named William Bratton was appointed chief of the New York City Transit Police, and he began doing something that his predecessors had not done with any consistency. He started arresting people for jumping turnstiles. This sounds trivial. At the time, to many New Yorkers who had spent years worrying about serious, violent crime, it seemed not just trivial, but actively misguided. A waste of police resources on minor infractions while murders were happening at a rate of nearly 6 per day across the 5 boroughs. The critics of the approach said exactly this, loudly and repeatedly. What Bratton and his colleagues had concluded, drawing on research by the social scientists James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, was that the physical and social environment of the subway was not a neutral backdrop to the crime happening in it. It was a contributing cause, a system where fare evasion was universal, where graffiti covered every surface, where broken equipment stayed broken for months, was a system that communicated permission for escalating disorder, permission for the more serious crimes that followed, disorder in patterns that were consistent enough to be predictive. The theory was called broken windows, and whether it was entirely correct has been debated ever since. The evidence is genuinely complicated. The aggressive policing strategies built around it caused real harm to communities of color that bore the disproportionate burden of enforcement. These are not small objections, and they are part of the story. But something happened to crime in New York in the 1990s that was real, dramatic, and consequential for the lives of millions of people. When Rudolph Giuliani was elected mayor in November of 1993, the city had recorded over 2,000 homicides in each of the previous 4 years. Giuliani appointed Bratton as police commissioner and gave him the mandate to apply the approach across the entire city. What followed was a decline in crime so rapid and so sustained that it became one of the most studied phenomena in modern urban sociology. By 1998, homicides in New York had fallen to 633, a reduction of more than 60% from the peak in less than a decade. Robberies, assaults, and burglaries fell at similar rates. The causes of the crime decline are still debated by researchers. Demographers pointed to changes in the age structure of the population. Economists pointed to the improving economy. Public health researchers pointed to the reduction in childhood lead exposure as leaded gasoline was phased out over the preceding 2 decades. A factor supported by substantial evidence across multiple independent studies. The policing changes played a role, though how large a role relative to the other factors remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is what the crime decline did to the city's perception of itself and its possibilities. New York, in the mid-1990s, began to believe, tentatively at first, and then with increasing confidence, that it might not be dying after all. The tourists came back. The restaurants multiplied. The neighborhoods that had been avoided after dark became destinations. The real estate market, which had been essentially flat through the late 1980s and early 90s, began to move with a momentum that would, within a decade, transform the economic character of the entire city. Wall Street was generating money on a scale that New York had never seen before. The deregulation of the financial industry that had been proceeding since the late 1970s accelerated through the 80s and 90s, producing new financial instruments, new trading strategies, and new categories of wealth that concentrated in Manhattan with an intensity that began to reshape the physical city as thoroughly as the Erie Canal had reshaped it 170 years earlier. The neighborhoods that wealthy people wanted to live in became more expensive. The artists who had moved into cheap lofts in Soho in the late 70s were expelled by the galleries and boutiques and eventually the professionals who followed them, and moved to cheaper neighborhoods in Brooklyn, which then became interesting, which then became expensive, which then expelled the artists again, in a cycle of displacement that repeated itself across the outer boroughs through the 90s and into the 2000s. The New York City of the late 1990s was in many ways the most functional version of the city that had existed in decades. Crime was down, the economy was up, the population was growing again, but the prosperity was not equally distributed. And the gap between the New York that was thriving and the New York that was being displaced or ignored was growing in ways that the aggregate statistics of the boom tended to obscure. The two New Yorks that had always existed were both present, just as they had been in every previous era. The difference was that the boom made it easier to look away from the second city. And then came the morning of September 11th, 2001. 2 hijacked aircraft struck the north and south towers of the World Trade Center at 8:46 and 9:03 in the morning. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59. The North Tower collapsed at 10:28. 2,977 people died. The Fire Department of New York lost 343 firefighters, the largest single loss of life for a fire department in American history. There is almost nothing about that morning that has not already been said. What needs to be understood is not in the words but in the silence that fell over the city in its immediate aftermath. A silence so complete and so wrong-feeling that every New Yorker who experienced it carries it as a physical memory decades later. The response of the city was not what the people who planned the attack may have anticipated. A city of 8 million competing individual interests. A city that had always been more commercial than communal, did not fracture. The lines of people waiting to give blood stretched for blocks. The volunteers who showed up at the site were so numerous that rescue workers already there had to turn most of them away. The restaurants near the site gave away food. The firehouses that had lost men received so many flowers and letters and visits from ordinary New Yorkers that the sidewalks in front of them became permanent shrines. The solidarity was real. The grief was real. And the city, as it had always done, eventually turned back toward the work of continuing. One World Trade Center. The tower that ultimately rose to 1,776 feet, a height chosen to reference the year of American independence, did not open until 2014, 13 years after the attack. The National September 11th Memorial, built in the footprints of the two towers, opened in 2011. The arguments about what to build, how much memorial and how much commercial, whose voices mattered most, lasted for years and were conducted with the full intensity that New York brings to every argument that matters. The financial crisis of 2008 hit the city with a severity proportional to its dependence on the financial sector that caused it. Lehman Brothers collapsed in September of 2008 and filed for the largest bankruptcy in American history from its headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. The crisis cost hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers their jobs, their savings, and their sense of security, but not their city. Major Michael Bloomberg, who served 3 terms from 2002 to 2013, managed the city's finances with a discipline that prevented the kind of structural deficit that had caused the fiscal crisis of the 70s. His public health initiatives made New York a laboratory for urban health policy that cities around the world observed closely. But consider what was happening on the ground during those same years. In a single week, in 2011, a young black man in Brooklyn named Taekwon Bowers was stopped and frisked by police officers 3 times in one afternoon without being charged with anything. He was not unusual. He was representative. The stop and frisk policing program that expanded dramatically under Bloomberg subjected hundreds of thousands of black and Latino New Yorkers to police stops each year. Stops that federal Judge Shira Scheindlin ruled unconstitutional in August of 2013, finding that the city had systematically violated residents' rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. And just blocks away from where those stops were happening, the super-tall residential towers going up along what became known as Billionaires Row on 57th Street were selling individual apartments for prices measured in tens of millions of dollars, to buyers who in many cases did not even intend to live in them full-time. 2 cities, same streets, same years. The lesson that New York had been teaching and relearning since 1626 was applied again after the financial crisis. You fall, you get up, you rebuild. By 2012, New York was growing again, the population reaching its highest point in history. The High Line, an abandoned elevated railway on the west side of Manhattan, had been transformed into a linear park that became one of the most visited public spaces in the city. A piece of urban imagination so successful that cities around the world began looking for their own abandoned infrastructure to convert. New York was still standing, as it always had been, as it always seemed to find a way to be. Chapter 13. New York Now. The city that refuses to be finished. On a morning in March of 2020, the streets of Manhattan were empty in a way they had never been empty before. Not empty the way they are at 4 a.m. on a Sunday, when the city has simply paused between one version of its activity and the next. Empty in a way that felt like something had been removed from the air itself. Some quality of motion and noise and collective human presence that New Yorkers had always taken as simply the condition of living here. The way fish take water for granted, until it was gone. The coronavirus pandemic arrived in New York before it arrived anywhere else in the United States at comparable scale, partly because of what New York is: a city of 8 million people in close proximity, connected to every other major city on Earth by daily flights, with a subway system that moves millions of people through tunnels and cars designed for a different era's understanding of how viruses spread. The conditions that make New York function, the density, the transit, the constant movement of people from everywhere to everywhere, were exactly the conditions that made it the first major American city to be overwhelmed. By early April of 2020, New York was recording several hundred deaths per day. The hospitals in Queens and the Bronx were treating patients in tents in their parking lots. The refrigerated trucks parked outside hospital loading docks, serving as temporary morgues, became the image that told the rest of the country what was actually happening here. More than 30,000 New Yorkers died in the first year of the pandemic. According to figures published by the New York City Department of Health that include both confirmed and probable deaths. A loss that fell with particular severity on the communities that had been telling the city for decades that their neighborhoods were underserved and their residents were vulnerable. The South Bronx, Central Brooklyn, Jackson Heights in Queens, the places where essential workers lived, where multi-generational households were common, where the option of working remotely did not exist. The economic destruction was immediate and severe. The restaurant industry, which employed hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, essentially stopped overnight. Hotels, retail, entertainment, the office towers of Midtown that had defined the city's working day for generations. All of them either closed entirely or contracted to fractions of their previous activity. The question that observers began asking about New York during the pandemic, and that they are still asking, is whether this time is different. Whether the combination of the pandemic's immediate damage, the rise of remote work that followed it, the continuing affordability crisis that makes the city increasingly inaccessible to working and middle-class people, and the social disorder that intensified during the pandemic years adds up to a challenge that the city's historical resilience is not sufficient to meet. It is a serious question. The people asking it are not wrong to ask it. The office vacancy problem is real and structural. When New York lost manufacturing jobs in the 1960s and 70s, it eventually replaced them with financial and service sector jobs that filled the office towers of Midtown and Lower Manhattan. If those towers are now partially empty because remote work has become a permanent preference for many employers and employees, the question of what replaces that economic activity does not have an obvious answer. The affordability problem is real and getting worse. Think about a nurse working the night shift at a hospital in the South Bronx, or a public school teacher in Brooklyn, or a subway motorman whose route begins at 5 a.m. in Queens. These are the people whose work makes the city function every single day. And increasingly, they cannot afford to live in the city where they work. Some commute 2 hours each way from places in New Jersey or Long Island or Connecticut because there is no apartment in the 5 boroughs within their budget. The implicit promise of New York that the people who make it function should be able to live in it is being broken in plain sight. The inequality that was already severe before the pandemic has been amplified by it. The people whose jobs could be done remotely, who could leave the city in the spring of 2020 and work from houses elsewhere while waiting for things to improve, were largely fine. The people whose jobs required them to be physically present, who had no option to leave, who lived in the dense neighborhoods where the virus spread most easily, bore a disproportionate share of the death and the suffering. The pandemic did not create the inequality of New York. It used the inequality that already existed as the primary mechanism of its destruction. And yet, the city is not empty. The streets of Manhattan on a weekday morning in 2025 are not the streets of March 2020. The restaurants are full. The subway is carrying its millions. Their construction cranes that have been a permanent feature of the New York skyline for 3 decades are still there, building towers whose purpose and whose tenants reflect the city's perpetual act of self-reinvention. The immigrants are still coming, not through Ellis Island, which closed as a processing station in 1954 and now operates as a museum whose exhibits draw visitors who often find in its records the names of their own ancestors. They come through John F. Kennedy International Airport and through Newark Liberty and through LaGuardia, on flights from Mexico and China and India and the Dominican Republic and Nigeria and Bangladesh and dozens of other countries. They settle in the outer boroughs, in the neighborhoods of Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx that have become, in the early 21st century, among the most ethnically diverse places on Earth. Jackson Heights in Queens is estimated to have residents speaking over 160 languages within a few square miles, a fact that even in New York is remarkable. The pattern that has repeated since 1626 continues: the arrival of people with nothing, the struggle, the partial and imperfect incorporation into the city's life, the building of something that becomes in a generation or two an established part of what New York is. It is slower now in some ways, because the city is more expensive and the distance between the rungs of the ladder has grown. But it has not stopped. The artistic energy that has characterized the city since the Harlem Renaissance has not stopped either. The neighborhoods that became unaffordable in Manhattan became unaffordable in the parts of Brooklyn that replaced Manhattan as the center of New York's creative life, which means the artists have moved further out again, to parts of the Bronx and Queens, replicating in the 21st century the geographic displacement that has been the consistent experience of New York's creative communities since the 1970s. What they are producing in those newer neighborhoods is not yet as visible as what came before, but that is how it always looks from the inside of a cultural moment before it becomes a cultural legacy. The city is 400 years old as a European settlement, and far older than that as a human place. It has never resolved the contradictions at its center. It has never finished the argument about who belongs here and what the city owes them. It has never stopped the tension between the accumulation of wealth at the top and the conditions of life at the bottom. It has never settled the question of whether its famous energy and ambition are available equally to everyone who arrives, or whether they are available to some and denied to others in proportions that no honest accounting has ever fully separated. These unresolved contradictions are not signs that New York has failed. They are signs that New York is alive. A city that had resolved all its tensions would not be a city in any sense that New York has ever understood the word. It would be a museum. New York is not a museum. Stand on the Brooklyn Bridge again. Look at the skyline. The One World Trade Center tower, rising above everything else on the lower end of the island, stands 3 blocks from the spot where Peter Minuit completed a transaction in 1626 that neither party fully understood. The financial district surrounding it is built on land reclaimed from the harbor. Land that did not exist when the Dutch arrived. Added by centuries of deliberate fill that pushed the shoreline outward as the city ran out of room and simply made more. The island is still too small for what is trying to happen on it. It has always been too small. That has never stopped it. 8 million people are going about their business in the buildings around you. Another million are on their way in from somewhere. The harbor is moving. The river is moving. The city is, as it has been since a Dutch trading company decided that this particular piece of geography was worth developing. In the business of becoming something it has not been before. That business has never been finished. It never will be. And that, more than anything else in 400 years of extraordinary history, is what makes New York, New York.